So we have our cylinder head off our 2006 X3 BMW. Originally, when we got this car, it was supposed to have had a blown head gasket. That turned out not to be the case, but there was an issue with the leak down on the cylinders. Both the intake and exhaust valves were leaking approximately 60 to 70% on every cylinder, so the head had to come off anyways. So we've gone ahead and pulled all of the valves, the intake and exhaust valves, also replaced the valve guides on the exhaust side as they were worn out, and we're able to resurface and recut the seats on all of the other valves. Now we're ready to get this back onto the engine. So before we put the cylinder head back on, I've gone ahead and changed the timing chain and guide rails. This motor has 177,000 miles on it, and since timing chains usually only last about 100,000 miles, I figured it would be good to go ahead and change that. I've cleaned the gasket surface on the cylinder block and retapped all of the threads so it's ready to accept the new cylinder head with gasket. And I've also gone ahead and washed down the side of the engine block so we can change the gasket that was leaking at the oil console and kind of clean it up a little bit. I've gone ahead and washed up the front engine timing cover and have installed a new front crank oil seal. So I just finished getting the front cover remounted back onto the engine, and now I'm going to install the front crank pulley. The front crank pulley has a keyway, so it'll only go on in one spot, and I'm just going to slide it on. That's it, ready for the bolt. So we got the nut back in on the front crankshaft pulley, and this one is torqued to 410 Newton meters, which is a really big number. You also do need the BMW special tool. There's two parts to that tool, one that locks into the vibration dampener, and the other one is the large bar that you can see that we've got going down to the ground. So I'm going to get my torque wrench set up onto my front crank bolt, and I've already set my torque wrench, and it's going to take some pulling to get this one all the way up to torque. There it is. So I'm going to install the new water pump, and this one has an O-ring to seal it to the front cover. So I'm just going to use a little bit of silicone grease to lubricate the O-ring. This is going to help preserve the O-ring as well as make it easy to install. You don't need to use any sealers on this kind of a surface either. So once it's lubed up, just going to go ahead, slide that in, and make sure it seats all the way by hand. Then I'm just going to turn it, make sure it doesn't have any restrictions like the impellers hitting something. It's nice and smooth. I'm just going to install the 4 nuts. And then tighten them up. These are going to have a torque of about 10 Newton meters. So I've got all my head bolts in. We're going to start from the center out in a radial pattern. This is a 3-step torque process. The first step is 40 Newton meters. So I'm going to go ahead and do that one first. That's the first stage complete. So our next step is going to be 90 degrees in the same rotational pattern. Now I'm just going to do the last 90 degrees. We're going to start cleaning up all of our camshaft towers, our camshafts, all of the bearing surfaces, make sure everything's clean and ready to assemble. I'm not going to wash the lifters though. These are the lifters. These need to be kept with each respective bore that they came out of, so we'll just probably wipe these down. The other thing, when we go to install these, we need to make sure that our pistons are about 30 degrees before top dead center so nothing hits. So I've already got the carrier for the camshaft installed, and I've put all the lifters in, and it's just sitting down on top of the valves right now. So the next thing that I need to do is I'm going to go ahead and install my exhaust cam. I've already washed everything up, everything is clean and ready to go. I'm just going to take my oil can first, and I'm just going to lubricate all of my camshaft bearing surfaces. For the oil that I'm using in my oil can, I use ATF. ATF I like, and I've used pretty much my entire career because it's a nice extreme pressure oil and it's pretty much compatible with about everything. Also just putting a drop of oil on each one of the lifter surfaces where the cam lobe is going to contact it. When I install the cam, I've already rotated the engine backwards approximately 30 degrees. And what that's done is it's dropped the pistons down. So when I put my camshaft in, I'm going to be opening valves depending on where the cam lobes are. So what we don't want to have happen is have a valve run into a piston. The next thing is, if we look at the cam, there's two dots on the back of our camshaft. These dots are going to be facing up for our initial installation. The other thing that we're going to be looking at is number one cylinder cam lobes. We'll be pointing at the intake cam lobes on about a 45-degree angle. So now I've got everything lubricated. Just going to go ahead and lay that in. Now the cam isn't going to want to sit perfectly flat because you're going to have cam lobes that are starting to engage. There is a BMW special tool that will apply pressure to the camshafts. Unfortunately, we don't have access to that one. So I'm going to be using the cam caps, and gently, by alternating how I install them and how I pull it down, I'm going to be pulling the camshaft down with that. At all times, I want to be careful to make sure that everything is moving freely and nothing's binding up. So I'm just going to take my oil can, go ahead and lubricate my bearing cap surfaces on my camshaft, and I'm going to grab my caps and my nuts and start installing. So I've got my cleaned bearing caps. I've lined them up. Each one is marked with the carrier, which is A for the exhaust side, and then they're numbered from the front 1 through 7 moving to the back. I'm also going to lubricate my studs with the same engine oil because I want to make sure that my nuts pull down nice and easily and consistently without binding. Okay, when I start putting my bearing caps on, I'm also going to give them a little bit of oil right there. And also oil underneath the surface where the nut's going to contact the cap. So you can see that not all the studs can get the nuts on, and that's because the cam lobes are holding the camshaft off the bearing surface. Also on the front camshaft here with our thrust surface, you notice that I've put that one on last, and even though I could push it down, I haven't done so. That's because the cam isn't sitting flat on the bearing surfaces yet, and if I push the thrust down, what it's going to do is going to cause it to bind up on the thrust surfaces here and here on the camshaft. So I'm just going to leave that one till last, and then I'll slide it down onto its locator and make sure the camshaft is located correctly. So when I'm starting to tighten it down, I want to take it nice and slow, and I'm just going to start with one bearing cap here in the center and just move it down enough until now I can get the thread started on the one next to it. We don't want to just try and crank it down using one bearing cap, because that's going to place a lot of stress on everything, including the camshaft. We want to make sure that I'm bringing it down nice and gently. I'm using a small ratchet, so I can't place a lot of force on tightening the nuts down, and I just want to bring everything down as smoothly and slowly as I can. So I've got the camshaft nipped down. I haven't done my final torque yet. And what I want to do is rotate the camshaft for two reasons. One, we can see our dots are not facing straight up on the cylinder head. They're kind of pointing off to one side. Two, before I do my final torque, I want to make sure that the camshaft rotates freely and isn't bound up. So I'm just going to take a 24mm wrench. There's a hex on the camshaft for this. And I'm just going to bring that cam around. And I'm going to be feeling how the camshaft rotates to make sure that it's not binding up in any way. You've got to bear in mind that you will be opening a valve, so it's going to have some tension. That didn't feel too bad. Now also you should be able to notice here that our thrust cap will now sit down all the way onto the bearing housing without any load. So I'm going to go ahead and put the nuts on that one. So when I torque everything, I can torque all of the nuts down at once. Okay, we're ready for our torque wrench. So there is no advertised torque pattern to this, so I'm just going to use best practice, which is to start at the middle bearing cap and work my way out. I have my torque wrench set to 14 Newton meters with an 11mm socket. Okay, last check I'm going to do is just put my wrench back onto the camshaft again. Make sure that it still moves freely, which it does, feels good. So the exhaust side is done. I'm going to work on the intake. So I have our intake camshaft tower all cleaned and washed up, as well as our valve tappets or hydraulic lifters. These are all in order, moving from the front. So you didn't see how I put the other one on. These lifters install from the bottom side and they just drop into this cam tower here. If you just sit all the lifters in there, then try and install this, they're going to want to fall out. That's just the way it is. Now, BMW has a special tool which you can install, which is like a suction cup on the back, and inside this tower you can see there's a little flat spot down there that the lifter will actually sit against. We don't have the special tool, so what I'm going to use is transmission prep. This is a very low melt grease. I use it when I rebuild automatic transmissions and manual transmissions, and it's designed to hold thrust washers and other components inside the transmission. Then it's designed to melt. It has a very low melting point and it comes out with the first oil change. The blue color is actually a dye, so you can tell if you have any oil leaks. So what I've done is I put a little blob sitting right on top of the lifter, and I've also lubricated around the side. So I'm going to line up this blob of oil with our little shelf down inside here. So when I press the lifter in, it's just going to press down and then it's going to stick. That way when I pick up the entire cam tower, I can sit it in on the studs and not have all my valve tappets fall out. So I'm just going to go ahead and put all of these together, and then I'll show you installing. Got all the lifters installed in the cam tower. I'm just going to give the valves a little bit of lubrication, just where the lifter is going to contact it, and then I'll grab the cam tower and sit that onto the engine. So when I bring it in, what I want to do, I've got my front up here. I'm just going to bring it into my studs, and even though I got grease into it, I don't want to spend a whole bunch of a time with it facing down, and I'm just going to roll it over and locate on my studs and slide it down. Now it's ready for the camshaft to be installed and tightened down. So the first thing I'm going to do now I've got the cams installed is I'm going to install the camshaft locating tool. This is the special tool that's going to sit on the back of our square drives. And the way that I'm going to install this is I'm just going to take this up to the back of the camshaft, and then I am going to move my camshaft as required until the tool sits flat on the cylinder head valve cover surface. Then I'm going to do the same with my intake cam. So I'm just going to sit that on there. And we can see how it's sitting up and it's not sitting flat, so I'm going to use my wrench. And I'm just going to turn that until the tool sits flat. Once the tool's flat, I can take this little locking mechanism, just rotate it along, and that'll just hold everything in place. So now I've got the camshafts locked into place. I'm going to use the timing pin to locate top dead center on the crankshaft. On an automatic transmission, you have to be careful because there is a hole in the flywheel that is before the actual timing mark. It is a much larger hole, so we're going to have to check that the crankshaft doesn't move once I get the timing pin in. So I'm going to bring the crank back up onto TDC because we were approximately 30 degrees retarded to begin with when we installed our camshafts. And I'm just going to start rotating it up slowly. And then I've got my timing pin is going to go into the engine case right here. There's a rubber plug that I've already removed. And I'm just going to slide in that pin until it contacts the flywheel. And then I'm going to slowly bring our crank up until I feel that pin drop into the hole. So I may have to go back and forth a little to get it to drop in. But it should locate itself in that flywheel, and once it does, the engine shouldn't turn. So now we've got our crank pin is located in the hole in the flywheel, and the crank is locked, can't go forwards, can't go backwards. So we're in the right place. So now I've got the camshaft set and I've got the crankshaft locked into position. The first gear to put on is going to be our primary drive gear. So there's a little arrow right here on the gear. This arrow needs to align with the gasket surface for the valve cover. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull up on my chain, kind of feed it around everywhere, and I'm just going to start by getting the gear fed in and on the chain as best as I can. And then we'll work on getting our timing point squared away. So with the chain wheel on, I've got my timing mark right here that's pointing right to the valve cover mating surface. If you need to advance it or retard it, all you've got to simply do is kind of pop the chain off a little, and you can pick up one link and just walk it around like that. The other thing you want to make sure too is when you're on the camshaft that the gear is seated and locked against the camshaft, and that you also put a little bit of tension back, because when we apply pressure with our timing chain tensioner down here, that's going to tension the slack side of the chain. We want to make sure the wheel is pulled tight against the pulled side of the chain. So we need to install our dummy timing chain tensioner to apply pressure against the timing chain. The problem is one of the AC pipes is in the way of the tensioner working. So rather than risk damaging the AC pipe by trying to bend it or move it, I'm just sucking down the AC system so we can go ahead and remove the pipe. So I've got the AC pipe out of our way. This is our dummy chain tensioner, and this is just going to screw into the side of the cylinder head. And right now we want to just screw the mandrel in and just nip it up until it tightens down against the cylinder head, like so. Then I don't want to apply a lot of pressure just yet. I'm just going to take up the slack. So I'm just going to bring the other adjustment up onto the pin like that. Next, I'm going to install the dowels into the exhaust cam. So these just screw in and then we'll torque them down. These are going to torque to 20 Newton meters. Next, I'm going to install the secondary tensioner. This is the tensioner that's going to provide pressure between the two gears, the intake and the exhaust cams for the variable timing. Because this one is a brand new one, it comes with the locking pin already installed. But if I was going to be reusing the original, we'd have to put our special tool to lock the tensioner down into the tensioner first. Just going to nip these down and then we'll torque them to 10 Newton meters. I'm going to put on the toothed sleeve. This has a groove in it right here. This groove needs to face this groove on the camshaft. You can also see the difference here. One's short, one's long. We want the short side to face in against towards the camshaft. So I'm just going to slide that in and then rotate it until that groove is facing that groove. Next, we're going to install the variable camshaft hub. We want to make sure that we lubricate these splines right here. If we look on it, it has a master spline both on the outside and on the inside that are going to locate here on our camshaft. So I'm just going to lube all of those splines before I install. So we want to line that up. And we want to push it in until we see these bolt holes become exposed right here. So that way we'll be able to get our fastener in. So the next thing we're going to do is put on our timing chain for the intake and exhaust cams. We're going to install the intake cam first. We want to make sure that this master groove is facing up towards the pins. So that's going to slide on like that. Then we're going to take our exhaust cam gear and it's going to locate on the tool like so. We're going to take our timing chain over it and just line everything up, and then this will slide out until it is tight, and we just want to make sure that everything is indexed and looking good, which it is. When we take this off, we want to make sure that we keep this tension on these chains and we don't let it skip a tooth, otherwise we'll lose our timing. So we're going to install our gear and chain assembly. We want to make sure that our master groove matches the master groove on the camshaft again. And we also want to make sure that we don't lose our chain alignment. So we need to keep a little bit of tension. This side of the gear is going to install into the intake camshaft. So we're just going to go ahead and slide this on. We need to also make sure that we guide the chain rail into the guide sleeve right there. And then I'm just going to rotate that until my grooves line up. My other chain is just sitting on the exhaust cam. Next, we're going to lubricate our Vanos cup, same as we did on the exhaust side. Inside splines as well as outside splines. Then we're going to line up our master key on both drives. We want to slide this one in until there is approximately about 1 millimeter of spline left showing. I'm going to install the thrust washer. This is directional. They should have an F marked on the front of them. This one does not. But you could see by the way it came off, it's the original, which way it was supposed to be installed. I'm just going to install the nuts right now, and I'm just going to tighten them down to nip them down. I am not going to torque them at this point. Next, I'm going to install the 3 bolts on our exhaust camshaft. And if we need to move our Vanos cup in and out just to align the bolt threads, we can. So we're going to tighten our exhaust bolts to 5 Newton meters, and then we're going to back them off a half a turn. This is just to seat the gear, and that is pretty much it. So now I'm going to install our thrust washer. Just line it up on the pins. Next we're going to install our concave washer. This has an F marking front. If you can't see the F anymore, you just want to look at the washer and you'll see how it's dished. You want that dish facing out towards the front of the motor. Then lastly, we're going to install our sensor wheel. This one has an arrow just like our timing chain gear did. That arrow has to face the timing cover gasket. So we're just going to slide that on like that. And then we're going to install our 3 nuts. And I've just nipped these down by hand for right now. So next, we're just going to pull back on this camshaft hub right here until it stops, and then we can go ahead and pop our tensioner spring. That'll take up the slack in the chain. So next we're going to install our timing tool. Our timing tool is basically a machined piece of aluminum that has 2 stops built into it. These stops are going to position our caps right here, and they'll adjust the timing accordingly. So I'm just going to install this onto the studs, and you can see here we're hitting on our exhaust side because we pulled it out before we started. And then I'm just going to pull these down using a deep socket. Then we want to make sure that we look down into the cutouts right here, and we want to make sure that our caps are hard up against the stops on both the exhaust side and the intake side. Next, we're going to go ahead and tighten our exhaust Torx head bolts down to 5 Newton meters. And then we're also going to tighten our nuts on the exhaust side and the intake side on our thrust washer, also to 5 Newton meters. Next, we're going to go through and tighten everything to its final tightening torque. The M6 nuts, which are these ones, are going to be torqued to 10 Newton meters, and then the M7 Torx heads will go to 20 Newton meters. So I'm going to do my M10s first. Then we're going to switch out and do our M7s next. And we're going to do our 7 millimeters to 20. So next we're going to rotate the engine twice. So we have to remove our camshaft locks. And we're also going to remove our timing pin. May have to wiggle the crank a little just to get it to come on out. There we go. Got our timing pin removed. Now I'm going to rotate the engine 2 revolutions and recheck our timing. We want to go direction of travel. I still have our dummy chain tensioner in and set, and so we want to be feeling as we turn that everything feels normal. We don't want to force the engine. If something feels funky, I want to stop and figure out what's going on. So there's 360 degrees. Okay, we're coming up close to our TDC on 720, so I'm going to get my pin ready back into locate for TDC. My pin just dropped back in. We're going to look at our dots. Both of the sets of dots on our camshaft should be facing up, but we need to reinstall our tools to make sure that everything is still lined up. Okay, so BMW says after you've rotated the engine around, you can have up to 1 millimeter of gap on the intake side of both the exhaust and the intake cams. So on where we're at right now, where the cams are sitting, that's pretty much exactly what I have. The backside on the exhaust side is contacting, but we've got a little bit of air gap right here and the same right here. So once the Vanos unit goes on, it's going to vary those cam timings, but we are within specifications. So now we're going to pull off all of our special tools. We'll pull off our timing mandrel, the camshaft locators, and the TDC pin, and continue to assemble the engine. So I'm going to pull out my dummy tensioner. This is the new assembled tensioner. It consists of a spring and a piston, and then there's an aluminum sealing washer. And then this is just going to compress against the chain. This is also oil pressure fed through this hole, so when the engine starts up, there'll be engine oil in behind this piston, and it'll kind of bleed off through the nose, but it'll keep constant pressure against that primary chain. So I'm just going to back off our chain tensioner down here. With the dummy tensioner out, I'm going to go ahead, slide in our new tensioner. It will be under spring pressure, so you're going to have to compress it, and then just be careful not to cross thread it. You do have to hold quite a bit of pressure against the chain. So I'm going to install the Vanos unit right now. I've got my gasket placed on the cylinder head. The last thing I've got to do is add a small amount of sealant right at the joint right here. So I'm just going to give it a very thin line. And we have to do this because the jointing surfaces wherever two pieces come together aren't always perfect. Okay, I'm just going to slowly pull these down. There is going to be a little bit of tension on this unit because this one on the Vanos is going to be under spring pressure. So I'm just going to bring it down slowly. With the Vanos unit installed, now I'm going to install the retaining screws. These are the retaining screws. They're a T30 bolt. These are a left-handed screw thread, so you got to remember to screw them backwards, and they're going to go in through the hole here to attach our pistons to the end of the camshaft. So I'm going to torque my two screws down in here, our Vanos screws, which are left-handed threads, to 10 Newton meters. Next, I'm going to install my plastic plugs, and these are just a push fit. And lastly, to finish it up, I'm going to install the plugs, the access plugs, and torque them. Now I'm just going to crank the engine over by hand, that I got the Vanos unit all mounted up, and make sure that our timing comes back to the same spot. It should make no difference, but it's just good practice before we close up the valve cover. I am back to TDC number 1. The exhaust cam and intake lobes are facing each other. Our dots on both cams are facing straight up. And I marked our TDC on the pulley this time, so I didn't have to use our locating pin, and that is pointing directly towards the marker. So we're all good, ready to put the valve cover on. When we put our valve cover on, we need to put sealant in a couple of places. We only need a very small amount. We're going to be applying some sealant on the corners right here. On both the front and the back, just to make sure we don't have any seepage there. And this is what BMW recommends to do. Then the last place I want to put sealant is just on this joint. Okay. Now all I want to do is make sure all my gaskets are kind of seated into their grooves. I'm just going to feel at the back, make sure my half moons are in place, which they are. Now all we got to do is put all our valve cover nuts in and tighten it down.